a tattoo meant to symbolize eternal love, a promise of devotion inked into skin forever. But for Jorge Chavez, the tattoo of his girlfriend's name across his chest became something far more sinister. What should have been a mark of love turned into a chilling emblem of obsession, control, and ultimately murder. This is the story of a man who couldn't let go, a woman who just wanted to help, and a tragic ending that no one could have foreseen. Stay with us as we unravel the disturbing details of this case. A turbulent relationship spiraling out of control, the horrific crime that shocked an entire community, and the trial that exposed the darkness lurking beneath a facade of love. What Jorge Chavez did will leave you questioning how far someone can go when love turns to obsession, and what warning signs we often overlook until it's too late. Daphne Michelle Davila was the kind of person everyone loved being around. At 27 years old, she was full of life, kind, and ambitious. Her friends described her as someone with a magnetic energy, someone who could make you laugh on your worst days. She had dreams, plans for the future, and a heart big enough to believe in second chances. That's what made her relationship with Jorge Chavez all the more baffling to those who cared about her. Jorge, 30, was charming at first. Like many abusive relationships, it began with romance, passion, and promises of forever. But as the months went on, cracks began to show. Jorge's charm gave way to possessiveness, his passion replaced by control. Daphne's friends noticed it too, the way he'd text her constantly, questioning her every move, wanting to know who she was with and where she was going. It started small, but it grew, as these things often do. At first, Daphne brushed it off. "He just loves me," she'd tell her friends. "He doesn't mean anything by it." But over time, his jealousy became suffocating. He'd show up unannounced, accuse her of things she hadn't done, and even isolate her from some of her closest friends. The tattoo came later, a dramatic and permanent gesture that Jorge saw as proof of his devotion. He had Daphne's name inked across his chest in bold letters, a statement to the world, and perhaps to himself, that she belonged to him. Daphne wasn't sure what to think of it. Part of her found it sweet, but another part felt uneasy. She joked about it to her friends, but deep down it unsettled her. What kind of person makes a decision like that without even asking? Their relationship had been rocky for months by the time Daphne finally decided to break things off. She told Jorge she needed space, that she couldn't handle his constant accusations and controlling behavior anymore. At first, he seemed to accept it. He apologized, promised to work on himself, and begged her not to give up on him. But when she didn't come back, his tone changed. Jorge began texting her constantly, alternating between pleading for forgiveness and sending angry, hurtful messages. "You'll never find anyone who loves you like I do," one message read. Another said, "If I can't have you, no one will." Daphne tried to move on with her life, but Jorge's shadow loomed large. Friends noticed her growing anxious whenever her phone buzzed or she thought she saw his car. She confided in a close friend, saying she wasn't sure what to do. "I think he's just hurt," she said, as if trying to convince herself. Despite everything, Daphne still believed Jorge could change. That belief led her to make the decision that would ultimately seal her fate. On January 4th, 2025, she agreed to meet Jorge. It was one day before her 28th birthday, and she thought they could talk things through, at least to find closure. She told a friend about her plan, assuring them, "I'll be fine. He's not a bad person. He just needs to hear me out." No one could have imagined how wrong she was. Jorge was desperate. His behavior in the weeks leading up to their meeting showed a man unraveling. Witnesses would later describe him as erratic and obsessed. He seemed unable to accept the idea of Daphne moving on without him. When Daphne arrived at Jorge's home that evening, it's unclear how their conversation began. Did he promise her he'd changed? Did he try to convince her to stay? Or had his anger already taken over? Whatever words were exchanged, the meeting quickly turned into something far more sinister. The neighbors would later report hearing raised voices, though none of them imagined the tragedy unfolding just beyond their walls. Jorge's emotions, boiling over for weeks, reached their breaking point that night. His love, twisted into obsession, turned deadly. What Jorge Chavez did next would shock even the most seasoned investigators. The crime scene left no doubt about his intent or his state of mind. Daphne's hope for closure, for resolution, had brought her to his home, but it would be the last place she'd ever go. As Daphne pulled up to Jorge's home on the evening of January 4th, 2025, she took a deep breath. She had convinced herself that this was the right thing to do, that seeing Jorge talking things through might bring the closure they both needed. Deep down, she hoped this meeting could be calm, maybe even productive. Despite everything, she wanted to believe that Jorge still had a good side, that the man she had once fallen in love with could show up one more time. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy. Jorge greeted her at the door, his face wearing a strained smile. To anyone else, it might have seemed polite, but Daphne knew him too well. She could sense the tension beneath it, the way his shoulders were stiff and his eyes darted around, as if he were trying to hide something. "Thanks for coming," he said, stepping aside to let her in. His voice was soft but clipped, the words carrying an undercurrent of something she couldn't quite place. Daphne stepped inside, the familiar surroundings of his home feeling oddly foreign. She glanced at the pictures on the wall, the furniture they had once shared quiet moments on. It felt like stepping into a ghost of their past. "I just wanted to talk," Daphne said, her tone calm but cautious. "I think we both need to move forward, but I want us to be okay, you know? No more fighting, no more tension." Jorge nodded, but the look in his eyes wasn't one of agreement. It was darker, more calculating. "I've been thinking about us a lot," he said, his voice tight. "I just don't understand how you could give up on me so easily." Daphne's heart sank. This wasn't going to be the peaceful conversation she had hoped for. "Jorge, it wasn't easy," she said gently. "But you know why I had to. Things weren't healthy for either of us. I needed space to find myself again." His jaw clenched and his hands balled into fists at his sides. "You think I didn't give you enough space?" he said, his voice rising. "I did everything for you, Daphne. He paused, gesturing to his chest, where her name was tattooed in bold letters. "I even did this for you, and it still wasn't enough." Daphne felt her pulse quicken. The room seemed smaller now, the walls closer. She took a step back, trying to de-escalate. "Jorge, that was your choice. I never asked you to do that. I appreciated it, but it doesn't change what happened between us." Her words only seemed to inflame him further. "You don't appreciate anything," he snapped. "You're just like everyone else. You take, and then you walk away." The argument spiraled from there. Jorge's voice grew louder, more erratic, as he paced the room. He threw accusations at Daphne, accusing her of abandoning him, of being unfaithful, of ruining his life. Daphne tried to calm him, her own voice shaking as she pleaded with him to sit down and talk rationally. But Jorge wasn't listening anymore. At some point, the conversation crossed a line. Jorge's anger, simmering for weeks, finally boiled over. What exactly triggered the moment of violence remains unclear. Perhaps it was something Daphne said, a final plea that he misinterpreted as rejection. Or perhaps he had been planning this all along, his rage building to a point of no return. In a fit of uncontrollable fury, Jorge attacked Daphne. The details of the assault are harrowing and heartbreaking. Investigators later revealed that Jorge used a knife, stabbing her multiple times in a frenzy that spoke to the depth of his rage. The wounds were severe, and it was clear from the scene that this was not a spur-of-the-moment action. It was a brutal and intentional act. Daphne's struggle to escape left evidence throughout the room. Overturned furniture, blood spatter, and signs of a desperate fight for her life painted a grim picture of her final moments. Despite her efforts, Jorge overpowered her. When it was over, the house fell silent once more. Jorge stood over Daphne's lifeless body, the weight of what he had done sinking in. The name tattooed across his chest now felt like a cruel irony, a permanent mark of a love he had destroyed with his own hands. Instead of calling for help or trying to save Daphne, Jorge fled. He left the house, the crime scene, and the woman he claimed to love behind him. In that moment, Jorge wasn't just running from the police. He was running from the consequences of his actions, from the reality of what he had done. Neighbors reported hearing loud noises that night, but no one called the police until much later. When officers arrived, the scene that greeted them was described as one of the most horrific they had ever encountered. Daphne's body lay in the living room surrounded by evidence of the violent struggle. Blood soaked the carpet, and the walls bore the marks of the chaos that had unfolded. The investigators immediately began piecing together what had happened. Jorge's absence raised suspicions, and it didn't take long for them to identify him as the prime suspect. His car was missing, and his phone was turned off, making it clear he had no intention of turning himself in. As the news spread, friends and family of Daphne were devastated. Her mother, speaking to reporters, could barely hold back tears. She didn't deserve this, she said. She wanted to help him, to give him closure. She thought he was still a good person deep down, but he took advantage of her kindness. Daphne's friends shared similar sentiments, describing how they had warned her to stay away from Jorge. She thought he could change, one friend said. She always believed in second chances, but sometimes people don't change. Sometimes they get worse. The community of Horizon City was shaken by the brutality of the crime. Candlelight vigils were held in Daphne's memory, with dozens of people gathering to honor her life and call for justice. For many, her death was a grim reminder of the dangers of toxic relationships and the importance of recognizing red flags. While the community mourned, law enforcement launched a manhunt for Jorge. They knew he wouldn't get far, and they were right. The search for Jorge Chavez began almost immediately after the horrifying scene was discovered in his home. Police quickly identified him as the prime suspect, but by the time they arrived at the house, Jorge was already gone. His car was missing, his phone was turned off, and it seemed clear that he had no intention of turning himself in. The manhunt that followed would bring a new layer of tension to an already devastating case. Law enforcement issued a statewide alert describing Jorge and the vehicle he was driving, a silver sedan with a license plate that was now burned into the minds of every officer on duty. Patrol cars were stationed at major highways, and officers were instructed to approach with caution if they spotted the suspect. Given the brutality of the crime, no one could predict how Jorge might react if cornered. As investigators delved deeper into the case, more disturbing details about Jorge's behavior began to surface. Text messages retrieved from Daphne's phone painted a chilling picture of a man unraveling. In the weeks leading up to the murder, Jorge had sent her a barrage of messages, alternating between begging for reconciliation and threatening her. One message read, "You can't just leave me like this. You'll regret it." Another was even darker. "If I can't have you, no one will." These messages, along with testimony from Daphne's friends and family, made it clear that Jorge's obsession had reached a dangerous breaking point long before the night of the crime. Investigators theorized that Jorge's decision to tattoo Daphne's name across his chest wasn't just a gesture of love. It was a claim of ownership, a way to assert control over her even as their relationship fell apart. Meanwhile, Jorge was on the move. Witnesses later reported seeing his car near a gas station just outside of Horizon City hours after the murder. Surveillance footage showed him filling up his tank, wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He didn't appear panicked or rushed. In fact, his calm demeanor was unnerving, a stark contrast to the violent act he had just committed. For nearly 24 hours, Jorge evaded capture. Police combed through tips and sightings, narrowing down his possible location. Finally, on January 5th, his car was spotted near Reeves County, over 200 miles away from Horizon City. Officers quickly moved in, setting up a roadblock to intercept him. When Jorge saw the flashing lights and patrol cars ahead, he didn't stop immediately. Instead, he attempted to turn his car around, leading to a brief pursuit. Officers described the chase as tense but controlled, with Jorge eventually pulling over on a desolate stretch of road. As officers approached his vehicle, guns drawn, Jorge raised his hands in surrender. The arrest itself was uneventful, almost eerily so. Jorge didn't resist, didn't lash out. He followed instructions calmly, stepping out of the car and allowing himself to be handcuffed. but his lack of emotion was chilling. One officer later said, "He didn't ask about Daphne, didn't ask why he was being arrested. It was like he already knew." Back in Horizon City, word of Jorge's arrest spread quickly. For Daphne's family and friends, it was a small comfort in an otherwise unbearable situation. Her mother, who had spent the night before pleading for answers, expressed relief that Jorge was in custody. "At least he won't hurt anyone else," she said. Jorge was transported back to El Paso County, where he was booked on charges of first-degree murder. As officers led him into the jail, reporters gathered outside, shouting questions. Jorge didn't respond, his face blank as cameras flashed. Inside the jail, Jorge was placed under close observation. Officers noted his calm demeanor, but they weren't taking any chances. Given the nature of the crime, there was concern that he might harm himself to avoid facing trial. As investigators began questioning Jorge, they hoped to get answers, some explanation for why he had done what he did. But Jorge remained tight-lipped. When asked about the crime, he simply said, "You wouldn't understand." For Daphne's family, the silence was infuriating. Her mother, through tears, spoke about the pain of not knowing why Jorge had taken her daughter's life. "She gave him so many chances," she said. "She believed in him, and he betrayed her in the worst way possible." Daphne's friends echoed this sentiment, expressing anger and heartbreak over the loss of someone so full of life. They described how Daphne had tried to see the good in Jorge, even when it was clear to everyone else that the relationship was toxic. Vigils were held across Horizon City in Daphne's memory. Hundreds of people gathered to light candles, share stories, and demand justice. At one vigil, a close friend of Daphne's addressed the crowd, saying, "We need to talk about domestic violence. We need to listen when someone says they feel unsafe. Daphne deserved better, and we owe it to her to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." For Jorge, the weight of his actions seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. Though he refused to confess to the murder, his silence spoke volumes. Investigators pieced together the timeline of events, relying on forensic evidence, witness testimony, and the disturbing messages Jorge had sent to Daphne. The crime scene itself was damning. Blood spatter analysis showed the ferocity of the attack, while the positioning of Daphne's body indicated she had tried to escape. The knife used in the murder was found in Jorge's kitchen sink, partially cleaned but still bearing traces of blood. As the evidence mounted, so did the public outrage. People couldn't understand how someone could claim to love another person so deeply, only to commit such a horrific act. The tattoo on Jorge's chest became a symbol of his twisted obsession, a permanent mark that now carried a much darker meaning. For Daphne's family, the trial couldn't come soon enough. They wanted answers, accountability, and most of all, justice for their daughter. Jorge's arrest was only the beginning of a long and painful journey for those who loved Daphne, and for a community determined to ensure her story would not be forgotten. The trial of Jorge Chavez began months after his arrest, but the pain for Daphne's family had not lessened. Every moment since that tragic night had been filled with questions, grief, and anger. For her mother, father, and siblings, the courtroom became a battleground, not just for justice, but for their daughter's memory. They wanted the world to understand who Daphne was, a loving, kind, and compassionate woman whose life was stolen by someone she trusted. The prosecution didn't hold back in their opening statements. They painted Jorge as a man consumed by jealousy and rage, someone who had become dangerously obsessed with controlling Daphne. The evidence was damning. The threatening text messages, the violent crime scene, and the chilling fact that Jorge had Daphne's name tattooed across his chest, an image now etched into everyone's mind as a grotesque symbol of his possessiveness. The prosecutor began by reading one of Jorge's final messages to Daphne aloud in court. "If I can't have you, no one will." Those words hung in the air, sending a shiver through the courtroom. Daphne's mother, seated in the front row, broke down in tears as the prosecutor continued. Her family, seated around her, tried to comfort her, but their own grief was just as palpable. Jorge, sitting at the defense table, showed no emotion as these words were read. He sat stoically, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him. For the family, his lack of remorse was another knife to the heart. He didn't even have the decency to look at us, Daphne's sister later said. He just sat there like it didn't matter. The prosecution called several witnesses, including Daphne's closest friends and family. Her best friend, who had spoken to her just hours before the murder, recounted their conversation in heartbreaking detail. She told me she was going to see Jorge, that she thought he just needed closure, she said, her voice cracking. I told her not to go. I begged her not to. But Daphne, she always wanted to see the best in people. Another friend testified about Jorge's increasingly erratic behavior in the months leading up to the murder. He would show up at places where he knew Daphne would be, uninvited, the friend said. He would send her dozens of messages in a single day. It was obsessive. We all told her to stay away from him, but she kept saying he just needed help. The most emotional testimony came from Daphne's mother. Standing before the jury, clutching a photo of her daughter, she spoke through tears about the pain of losing her child. She was my sunshine, she said. She had so much love to give, and she wanted to help everyone, even him. But he took advantage of her kindness. He took everything from us. The defense, meanwhile, struggled to counter the overwhelming evidence. Jorge's attorneys attempted to argue that the crime wasn't premeditated, claiming it was a crime of passion, a tragic but impulsive act. They pointed to Jorge's lack of prior violent offenses and argued that he had been under emotional distress at the time of the murder. But this argument fell flat in the face of the evidence. The prosecution was quick to dismantle the narrative, presenting Jorge's behavior as calculated and deliberate. They highlighted his repeated threats, the disturbing text messages, and the fact that he had lured Daphne to his home under false pretenses. The jury also saw images from the crime scene, which left little room for doubt about the brutality of the attack. The photos, though heavily censored for the courtroom, were enough to bring some jurors to tears. They showed the chaos of the room, overturned furniture, blood spatter, and the knife used to take Daphne's life. For Daphne's family, seeing these images was unbearable. Her father, who had remained stoic throughout most of the trial, had to leave the courtroom during this part of the testimony. Her mother sobbed quietly, clutching the hands of her other children. The family later told reporters that reliving Daphne's final moments was like losing her all over again. When Jorge finally took the stand in his own defense, the courtroom was silent. Everyone waited to hear what he would say, if he would show any remorse or offer any explanation for his actions. But his testimony only deepened the anger of those who had lost Daphne. Jorge claimed he didn't mean to kill her, that the argument had escalated unexpectedly. I just lost control, he said, his voice flat and emotionless. He didn't apologize to Daphne's family, didn't acknowledge the pain he had caused. Instead, he portrayed himself as a victim of circumstance, someone who had been overwhelmed by his emotions. The prosecutor didn't let him off easily. In a blistering cross-examination, they confronted him with his own words, the threatening messages, the obsessive behavior, and the tattoo that had once been a symbol of love but now felt like a brand of ownership. You didn't lose control, the prosecutor said. You made a choice, a deliberate, calculated choice to take her life. For Daphne's family, hearing Jorge's excuses was infuriating. He didn't lose control, her sister said after the trial. He knew exactly what he was doing. He wanted to punish her for leaving him. After weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for only a few hours before reaching a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. The announcement was met with a wave of emotion in the courtroom. Daphne's family hugged one another tightly, their tears a mixture of relief and grief. It doesn't bring her back, her mother said later, but at least we know he won't hurt anyone else. The judge sentenced Jorge to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In delivering the sentence, the judge addressed Jorge directly, saying, "Your actions were not those of a man overcome by passion. They were the actions of a man consumed by control and obsession. You took a life, and you will spend the rest of yours facing the consequences." For Jorge, the tattoo on his chest would serve as a permanent reminder, not of love, but of the life he had destroyed. Daphne's family, though grateful for the verdict, knew their journey was far from over. The pain of losing her would never fully heal, but they vowed to honor her memory by raising awareness about the dangers of toxic relationships. "If you see the signs," her mother said, "don't ignore them. Don't let someone you love think they have to stay in a situation that makes them feel unsafe." This case is a sobering reminder of how quickly love can turn dangerous, and how important it is to listen to the warning signs. Daphne's story will not be forgotten, and her family continues to fight for change in her honor. What are your thoughts on this tragic case? Share your comments below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video to spread awareness. Let's ensure Daphne's story becomes a beacon of hope and a warning to those who need it most. The sentencing of Jorge Chavez to life in prison without the possibility of parole brought some measure of relief to Daphne's family, but it didn't erase the grief or the unanswered questions. As Daphne's mother tearfully expressed outside the courtroom, "We may have gotten justice, but it doesn't bring her back. Every day we wake up and feel the emptiness she left behind. Her laughter, her kindness, her light, it's all gone because of him." Daphne's siblings shared similar sentiments. Her younger sister, visibly emotional, told reporters, "We'll never get to see her smile again. We'll never get to celebrate her birthdays, her milestones. Jorge took all of that from us, and now we're left to pick up the pieces." While the family was grateful that Jorge would spend the rest of his life behind bars, they also expressed frustration at the deeper issue this case highlighted: the dangers of toxic relationships and the difficulty of recognizing them before it's too late. Daphne thought she could save him, her brother said. She believed he could change. She gave him the benefit of the doubt, even when we all told her to walk away. But that's just the kind of person she was. She saw the good in people, even when they didn't deserve it. This is the heartbreaking reality for many families who lose a loved one to domestic violence. The signs, though often present, can be difficult to act on, especially when someone is determined to see the best in their partner. For Daphne's family, this case wasn't just about seeking justice. It was about spreading awareness and preventing others from experiencing the same pain. In the months following the trial, Daphne's story became a focal point for discussions around abusive relationships. Her friends and family launched campaigns to educate others about the warning signs of controlling and obsessive behavior, urging people to speak up if they notice someone they care about in a dangerous situation. But the question remains, could more have been done to protect Daphne? Could someone have intervened sooner? These are difficult questions with no easy answers, but they are questions worth asking. This case also raises another deeply unsettling issue. How does someone who claims to love another person so deeply end up destroying them? Jorge Chavez's actions defy logic and humanity. His tattoo, once meant to symbolize eternal love, became a grotesque symbol of his possessiveness. It wasn't love, it was ownership, control, and obsession. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about toxic relationships. When does passion turn into control? When does love become dangerous? These are the lines that Jorge crossed, and they're lines that many people may not even realize they're approaching until it's too late. Some viewers might wonder, did Jorge ever truly love Daphne? Or was it always about control? His lack of remorse during the trial, his cold demeanor even as her family mourned in the courtroom, speaks volumes about his character. How can someone so easily extinguish the life of a person they claim to love? The answer perhaps lies in his obsession. Jorge didn't love Daphne in the way most people understand love. He loved the idea of her, the version of her that he could control. And when she broke free from that control, it wasn't her happiness he cared about. It was his own ego, his own inability to accept that he couldn't have her. Now we turn to you, the viewers. What are your thoughts on this tragic case? Do you think Jorge Chavez's life sentence was enough, or do you believe he deserved something harsher? How do we as a society prevent tragedies like this from happening? Have you ever witnessed someone in a toxic or controlling relationship? What would you do if a loved one was in a similar situation to Daphne? And perhaps the most difficult question of all, how do we help people like Daphne, who want to see the good in others? Recognize when a relationship is no longer safe. This story isn't just about Jorge and Daphne. It's about the broader issue of domestic violence, toxic love, and the warning signs that we so often overlook. Your voice matters. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What lessons do you think we can take from this case? Remember, it's not enough to just feel sad or angry about what happened to Daphne. We need to turn that pain into action, whether it's educating ourselves and others about the dangers of abusive relationships, supporting those who might feel trapped, or advocating for stronger protections against domestic violence. Thank you for watching this video and for being part of this important conversation. If Daphne's story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that bring light to the darkest corners of human behavior. Let's keep Daphne's memory alive by ensuring her story makes a difference. Together, we can work toward a future where love never turns into tragedy